Mthokozisi. So our next session is going to focus on the political economic context. I think we've had the challenges with respect to fiscal policy, and now we're going to look at what is the context that spending choices ought to be made. And we have a fascinating discussion. We've got Professor Steven Friedman in the room. We've got other panelists who are actually joining us online. And I'll also ask Thoko also to come on stage and join us. So can we please give a warm round of applause to Professor Steven Friedman as he comes on stage together with Thoko. Thank you. We also have Mthokozisi Tshuma, who is a policy specialist from the United Nations Development Program, who is joining us online. So if I will just ask my technical team to please help us with that. So our session, Prof, is scheduled that you will give us a talk or a presentation for about 20 minutes. And Andreas will also make a presentation for about 20 minutes. And thereafter, we're going to have a discussion. We take questions from the floor. We also have an online platform whereby the participants are going to type questions and comments for that opportunity. Professor Steven Friedman is a professor from the University of Johannesburg. He is a research professor in the humanities faculty. He's a political scientist whose specialty is political theory and political economy. He has regularly participated in public debate through newspaper columns and is the author of several books, including Prisoners of the Past, a study of contemporary South Africa. Then I'll jump on to Thoko Madonko. And I'll just apologize if, for example, I'm getting your names, spelling them incorrectly. Okay, just a second. Okay, so Mthokozisi is currently a researcher at the Southern Center of Inequality Studies at Wits, managing the Public Economy Project. Using her master's in political theory, she has worked in the areas of climate justice, development cooperation, public finance with a focus on health financing and gender responsive budgeting, national, subnational, and parliamentary governance, transparency, and accountability. Over the years, she has served as a program manager in the Boel Foundation, coordinator of the Budget Expenditure Monitoring Forum, and an organizer of the People's Health Movement in South Africa. And then we'll introduce Andreas as well, who is joining us online together with Mthokozisi. Okay, Andreas is a visiting research fellow at the Research Department of the South African Reserve Bank and a lecturer at the University of Technology. He retired from the OECD in 2016. Before, he was responsible for economic surveys and projections of 17 countries, among them South Africa, Turkey, Russia, Ukraine, and Germany. Before joining the OECD Economics Department in 2000, he pursued an academic career in economics at the Institute for Advanced Studies and the University of Technology in Vienna. Then we go to Mthokozisi. Okay, Mthokozisi Tshuma is a policy specialist focusing on inclusive growth from the United Nations Development Program. He's an economist with a strong macroeconomics, microeconomics, and econometric background, and able to conduct independent research and global and regional economic, social, and development issues, and determine suitability, validity, and accuracy of data from different sources. So I think with that long biographical introduction, we really have a fascinating panel. So we'll start with you, Prof. You give us your presentation for about 20 minutes, and then we'll take Andreas, and thereafter do the discussions.
Thank you. Thanks. Are those 20 human minutes or academic minutes?
They're in the spirit of austerity, I would believe they are human.
Human minutes, oh well. I tried. I can't be accused of not trying. And just one correction, which is not the chair's fault because it has to be corrected. I don't do newspaper columns anymore because none of the newspapers will publish them. But I do a subscription column each week which goes out to subscribers all over the country, and one in America. So we could have a 3-minute break while you all get online and subscribe, or you can do so after the session. Okay, having got the commercial out of the way. As you will have gathered from the rest of the CV, I'm interested in political economy, but as you will be hearing, far more from the political angle than from the economic angle. So I don't have any numbers to put up or any graphs, etc. But a lot of what I have to say will be based on an interpretation of the work of an economic historian, whose name will hopefully be familiar to some people in the room, Douglas North. Now, what I want to do is to suggest that the way in which we tend to think about the economy and the way in which we tend to discuss the economy at events like these, and generally when people trained in economics meet, is not the appropriate way of understanding what is happening in South Africa and what needs to happen in South Africa. And perhaps just to flesh that out a bit, I mean, what I have in mind is that I have for a while been both fascinated and appalled by, what, to be polite, one could call in this country the jobs debate. And it really is polite to call it a debate, because how in fact the jobs debate works is that whatever your particular economic or political perspective, whether you're a free marketeer or a Marxist-Leninist or something in between, it has become almost compulsory to insist that if we simply do what you tell us to do, we will create millions of jobs. And of course, they differ slightly. Some of them claim we'll create 6 million, and some of them create 8 million. And any day now, somebody will claim that they have the formula for creating 10 million. And of course, what we do see is something which one could call magical thinking. And the way in which magical thinking works is that whenever the policy recipes which the people in the debate advocate are tried, they don't create all these millions of jobs. And then when you say to the people, but your policy recipes don't provide 8 million jobs, they say, oh no, well, you didn't apply them properly. You need to apply them in a more vigorous manner. And of course, that's an infinite escape clause, because you can never apply them in as vigorous a manner as the people who are advocating them suggest. And I've been intrigued for quite some time by why we have this debate when it is so clearly disconnected from reality. And I try to give the answer in a book of mine, which was published a couple of years ago, in which I try to look at where South Africa is almost 30 years into democracy. And that is where Douglas North's work became important, although if you ever get to read the book, I'm not an uncritical admirer of North, so I engage with him in the book, and I think that there are problems about some of what he has to say. But one of the contributions which North made to our discussion of economics and how it affects the well-being of human beings is that he wrote quite a bit of what he wrote because he was very unimpressed by and very unhappy with what was the World Bank orthodoxy at the time. And the World Bank orthodoxy at the time was, we need to get the prices right. As long as we get the prices of land, labor, and capital right, then all good things will flow from that. And North noticed that too didn't seem to conform to reality, because every time people got the prices right, all the good things didn't flow from it. And what he suggested was that the problem was not the prices, the problem was what he called institutions. And He incidentally has had quite a lot of influence on the World Bank and other institutions, because within a few years of North's work appearing, they stopped talking about getting the prices right, and they started talking about getting the institutions right. Now, one of the frustrating things about Douglas North, if you read his work, is that he writes a great deal about institutions, but he never actually goes into any particular detail on what he thinks institutions are and what they're not. Fortunately, we have the work of scholars who've been influenced by North, and they tell us that there are three elements to institutions. And I'll come to those three elements in a moment. But the importance of institutions in all of this is that North developed the concept of path dependence, which is central to what I'm trying to do in the book. And you've probably all heard the phrase, etc., but in case you haven't, path dependent, what North was trying to do with path dependence was to say that societies could change some things, and particularly they could change their political systems. But if they didn't change their institutions, then they would carry on much as they had before economically. And as I mentioned, North was an economic historian, and he was interested in growth, and he was trying to show why in some countries all the right economic recipes had been applied, but growth had not been the result of that. And he said, well, the reason for that is path dependence, because people carried on with the same institutions. And if you carry on with the same institutions, it doesn't matter what economic recipes you apply, and it doesn't matter whether you change your political system or not. Now, I said I'd come back to what institutions are, how we understand, how I understand institutions. And using the work of a scholar influenced by North called Scott Page, we take three elements of institutions which may remain the same when a society is changing. And the three institutions are behavior patterns, and that, for our purposes, that's, if you like, the way in which people operate in the marketplace, the way in which people operate in formal businesses, the way in which people operate in the profession, etc. Do they continue to operate much the same way as they did before? The second one is cognitive patterns, which really is what we value and what we don't value. And the third one is relationships. In other words, relationships between business and government, relationships between sections of business and political power, etc. And essentially the argument is that if you change your political system or you change your economic policy, and those three elements remain the same, the behavior patterns, the cognitive patterns, and the relationships, then nothing much will change. Then you will continue to have slow or low growth. As you might have gathered by this stage, I find this very useful because I think it is a very accurate description of South Africa in the year 2023. Because we did change our political system in 1994, but we really didn't change all that much else. The expectations of what it takes to promote growth are very much the same as they were. And the structure of the economy isn't that much different. I always try, it's just as a kind of illustrative point, some of us are old enough to remember that in the last decade or so of apartheid, it used to be mentioned repeatedly that 5 companies controlled 90% of the equity on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Well, right now, about 20 companies control 80% of the equity on the JSE. So you can say it's progress because there are more companies and slightly less equity, but you wouldn't seriously say that the overall pattern had changed significantly. And that is true of much of what is done in the economy. The amount of effort which is an energy which is devoted to the formal economy is disproportionate when we remember that by my rough calculation, it's a rough calculation, but I give the numbers and what it's based on in the book, about 2/3 of adults in this country can't get into the formal economy. So we tend to spend a lot of time, and yes, obviously that is where the wealth is, that's where the economic power is, I'm not being unrealistic about that, but we tend to spend an inordinate amount of time when we talk about issues like poverty, like job creation, on focusing on the experience of 1/3 of the population than we do about the 2/3 of the population. And one of the ways in which path dependence operates, which is crucial to the way in which we look at the economy, is this point that Page makes about the cognitive patterns, about what we consider important and what we don't consider important. And it begins to explain why, in an economy in which 2/3 of adults are engaged in some kind of informal activity because they can't break into the formal activity, we continually talk about only formal sector jobs. And I argue that the reason for that is that one of the cognitive patterns which remains the same is that what we've been trying to do, or what the people who make the decisions have been trying to do in this society since 1994, is that we've been trying to create what I call in the book white privilege for everybody. What I mean by that is, if you take the way in which white people lived at the height of apartheid, that is taken as the norm of how everybody should live. And one can understand why that is the case. But one can also understand that it is clearly an entirely unrealistic view. Because we should be aware that the way in which white people lived under apartheid was possible only because the vast majority of people were excluded from opportunities. So the idea that you can extend to everybody what some people have because they excluded everybody else is not a particularly realistic example, and I give in the book some concrete cases in how this works. But one of the things that happened at the height of apartheid, if you were a white person, and for a while even if you were a black person, but that didn't last terribly long, is that you were pretty much assured that once you got to adulthood, you would find yourself a job in a factory or an office or a shop. And the model in everybody's heads, therefore, of what a workable economy which meets people's needs is one in which everybody gets up in the morning and goes to a shop or a factory or an office. And that is why we have people promising 8 million such jobs, 6 million, and et cetera, as I went through before. But as I've just said, it's not a realistic proposition. It's not a realistic proposition for a variety of reasons. One obvious point is that South Africans sometimes like to think that we're different from the rest of the world, but we're not all that different from the rest of the world. And the kind of jobs which white people used to go to in the 1960s are being extinguished all over the world. So it's not quite clear how they're miraculously going to reappear. In a period where people are talking about driverless cars and artificial intelligence, etc., the idea that somehow everybody is going to be working in those mass production jobs which were available in the 1960s doesn't seem a particularly plausible idea. So that is the reality with which we sit. And that means that although I'm obviously not being extreme about this, I'm not saying that formal job creation is irrelevant and we should stop talking about it. It does seem to me that we need to recognize that in the lifespan of everybody in this room, and probably their children, and even quite possibly their grandchildren, there are going to be very large numbers of South Africans, whatever economic model we adopt, who will not be participating in the formal economy, who will not be getting up in the morning and going to those shops and factories and offices. And the question, therefore, has to be, well, what is the policy challenge? How do we deal with that? And it doesn't seem to, it obviously creates difficulties, etc., and challenges, but then any serious policy problem does that. That we need initially to start thinking of this in a different way. And the different way in which we need to start thinking of it is that we need to start talking less about jobs and we need to start talking more about livelihoods. And of course, the difference between jobs and livelihoods is that a job means you have a formal employer, and a livelihood means that you have a variety of, it obviously includes formal employment, but there are also other ways in which, whether it's backyard panel beating or selling fruit and vegetables on street corners or whatever the case may be. Once we start doing that, it becomes possible to I think, begin having a serious conversation about, to take the theme of this particular panel, what our spending priorities ought to be and what our policy priorities ought to be. Now, I think it's very important when I make this point to stress what I'm not saying as well as what I am. The argument that informal economic employment is important has been around in this country for a very long time. In fact, it used to be used by certain people under apartheid as a rather shabby excuse for that system's failure to pay any attention to the welfare needs of 90% of the population, because they'd simply say, oh yeah, well, those black people who aren't participating in the economy, they're all busy in the informal sector somewhere. And there was it became clownish at one point. I remember one person who used to appear at conferences, etc. He used to start his speeches usually by saying, the informal sector is entirely unrecorded and entirely unresearched, and it consists of 12.7 million people earning it. Which raised the obvious question of, well, it's entirely unresearched, and I talk about how did he know how many people there were and what they were earning? And of course the answer was he didn't know. He was making it up as he went along because it was a nice rhetorical flourish. The point I'm trying to make through that is that it can very often, the emphasis on the informal can very often become an excuse for simply allowing economic practices and patterns which do not contribute to human welfare. And of course, as in the case I mentioned, it can be used as an excuse for all sorts of things. That is the case if we assume that the stress on the informal and on livelihoods rather than jobs means a very simple laissez-faire approach in which we say, well, get rid of all the health regulations and all the bylaws, etc., and just let people do their own thing. And that is not at all what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is that we need simply to recognize that this is a reality which we have to have a policy response to. And that policy response inevitably, if it's a pragmatic response and it's a response which is rooted in the actual circumstances in which people live rather than in very abstract theories based on our desire to recreate something which white people enjoyed a very long time ago, will be a mixture of some of the deregulation measures, but also some interventionist measures. It would presumably entail freeing people up more to do what they're doing at the moment. But on its own, that would not really change the welfare equation unless there were also positive programs which stimulated what people were doing, hooked them up to the formal economy where that is appropriate, and enabled them to actually develop what they're doing rather than simply staying where they are at the moment. One of the participants said, well, when you see people being exploited on the street, when you see people begging, etc., that is also a livelihood. And of course, they're quite right. And that is why we need to see it as a policy challenge rather than a simple exhortation to simply deregulate and let things develop as they may. You may be talking, for example, about measures at some point which compel formal sector businesses, where appropriate, to have a relationship with informal businesses, a procurement relationship or something else which enables them. And you would also probably have to do something serious about the lobbying power of formal businesses, because we don't often recognize in our policy debate, and I'm generalizing to a certain extent, but a great many of the obstacles which are placed in the way of informal activity in this country are placed there by business lobbies, very often the same business lobbies who extol the free market, but who don't like the idea of being undercut and the competition of people in the informal economy. So that is by way of saying that there are a host of policy challenges and policy debates which flow from concentrating on the informal. But we do need to get beyond the jobs debate, and we do need to get into the livelihoods debate. Because if we don't do that, I'm afraid the reality is simply that the conversations that we have about the economy are increasingly going to be deeply detached from reality. I had the privilege some years ago of participating in a project with African central bank governors, in which we try to debate various political economy issues. And one of the striking features of this engagement is that the people we were dealing with were extraordinarily talented, extraordinarily intelligent economists and with a very sophisticated grasp of economics. But the one thing they found it difficult to accept is the extent to which the formal market in which they were engaged was largely detached from the economic reality of most of the citizens of the country, which of course is why very often the prices which applied in the formal marketplace were not those which applied out in the streets where people were engaged in economic activity. Because sophisticated people everywhere like to believe that everybody is in the same space as they are and doing the same things as they are, even when reality suggests that's not the case. So to sum up, I believe that one of the effects of path dependence in this country is that we are currently looking at the economy in a way which sees only the formal economy as it currently operates as a potential source of jobs and therefore of welfare, and that we tend to see the kind of economic patterns of behavior which prevail in that sector as the ones with which we need to engage if we're going to formulate workable policy. I'm challenging you to contemplate the possibility that we need to look at this from a different perspective, that we need to look at the realities in the society, the ways in which people are generating livelihoods and could generate greater livelihoods in the future, and that ought to be the building block from which we debate policy in the future. Thank you. And sorry about the coughing, but it seems to have gone.
That's good. Thank you so much, Prof. We are then now going to switch on to Andreas. He also has a presentation focusing on the labor utilization in SA. You have about 20 minutes as well. Andreas, if you could please stick to the time, because I think we're going to have really insightful discussions. So let's save more for later. Over to you.
So I hope you can see and hear me now. Well, I mean, this presentation by Professor Friedman is, of course, fascinating, especially for me as an economist. And I could make my job, of course, easier, and I could say, okay, let's just accept that economists are incapable of saying anything that helps understanding the economy, either in South Africa or anywhere else. And so we have saved the extra 15 minutes that Professor Friedman has used for his presentation. Now, I will not take this shortcut, but I'm insisting, and as it has been mentioned already before, I have my last active job was with the OECD, and I mean, the special thing about the OECD is that it tries and it has the ambition to do comparative analysis, to look how are things happening in many countries of this world, and what can countries learn from each other. So now try to solve the next challenge to upload my presentation. Okay, here we are. My starting point is, oh, sorry, I'm too far. My starting point is this figure here. I have to apologize in advance for the slides. I hope on your screens they are looking better than on my screen. What this figure shows is how far behind in terms of formal sector economy, formal sector economic activity, are various countries, and how can this difference be disaggregated into the, let's say, lower productivity and in the participation of the population in economic activity, meaning in working. And then you see these little triangles are the aggregates of the two. And the third, I don't know whether you see my little arrow moving on your screens, I hope at least. The third country from the left is South Africa. And we see, at least this is what I want you to see, that South Africa is an outlier. It has organized its economy differently from all the other economies that are shown on this figure here, which are mainly emerging markets from India to Turkey. Now, roughly speaking, let's say the situation is such that in most countries, except South Africa, lagging behind the top formal sector economies of this world is mainly due to a lower productivity. So these are these long bars here. And participation in the economy by the population, meaning working, contributing to economic activity. Now, I have to say this both refers to formal sector activity and informal sector activity. That for these purposes, it doesn't matter whether you work in the formal sector or not in the formal sector. And here we see that South Africa has the highest share of the population that is not participating in economic activity, no matter whether it is formal sector activity or informal sector activity. And that, of course, contributes to, let's say, the lagging behind of living standards on average that we can see in this country. And I will also argue that this is also behind the still appalling rate of inequality that we can observe in this country. So South Africa is one of the highest inequality indicators in the world. So what I would like to do now is to take a look what I think is contributing to this phenomenon. So why inactivity is such a widespread issue in South Africa, contrary to any comparable other country in this world. So I of course, no big phenomenon, neither in economy or in politics, has one single explanation. So it's a whole bouquet of reasons that are contributing to this outcome. But I think one of the most visible problems in the South African way of how to organize its economy is how the transition of school leavers, that do not go on to university, one has to make this separation. How are they getting into employment? And this transition for, let's say, either secondary school dropouts or secondary school graduates that are not going on to university, it is just not working. And if you like here, let's say my capacity as an OECD economist is becoming visible. The question is, are there other countries that are doing a better job here? And there are. A second issue is that regional and gender gaps of economic activity and also availability of jobs are very high in South Africa. That's contributing to this issue of inactivity, because if you are living in a region where there are no jobs, transport costs are exorbitant, and the availability of housing closer to where the jobs are is not very good, or at least it is not affordable, for the kind of job holders that would be wanting to move into these jobs. Then this again is a major source of keeping people inactive just where they are living. Now, I'm also a macroeconomist, and there, of course, it is clear that economic activity and employment are linked. Now we know that South Africa has a bad record of economic growth since more or less about 15 years. The economy is barely growing, and therefore, I mean, all these millions of jobs that are promised by introducing the right policies are not created, which is not surprising, because if the economy doesn't grow, then you will also not have job creation. So I think we should also take a look into this. So, as I mentioned before, one of the major reasons for inactivity is that youth unemployment is very high. So there are surveys that show that about 80% of youngsters that have either graduated from secondary school and not went on to university, or have dropped out from school are still unemployed. And the three humps that you see on the right-hand side of this slide, they show the employment rates in South Africa, in Brazil, and in OECD countries. And I mean, what you see there is that that in South Africa, it just takes 10 to 20 years longer, in terms of age, until, let's say, the highest employment shares are reached for the population overall. So that means during that time, people are inactive. They are sitting somewhere, literally, and waiting for a job to be offered to them. And that, for instance, in Brazil, that's not the case, yeah? I mean, or in the OECD as a whole, it's also not the case. And this has a lot to do with the way how the transition from school to jobs is organized. Now, in countries where this transition is working very well, these, for instance, are continental European countries like Germany, Netherlands, Austria, Switzerland. This transition is organized in the way of vocational training, yeah, that is offered in parallel to an employment position in a company, and where the employers are having decide, yeah, who is participating in this vocational training and vocational education track. And employers also provide an employment guarantee once this education or this type of school is finished. And therefore, it is, it is no wonder that, for instance, in a country like Germany, 25% of a cohort that is leaving school and doesn't move on to university is participating in such an arrangement. And another 25% is enrolled in vocational schools, yeah, without sort of an employment contract, but with employers and social partners very closely working together to decide about the curriculum in these schools. And therefore, graduates from these educational programs, they have an employment rate of, let's say, between 95 and 100% after they graduate. Yeah, so this is just the opposite. So, I mean, what I want to say, of course, is fascinating what Professor Friedman says. But I think we should also keep our mind open for experiences in other countries. So not necessarily, yeah, the way how South Africa is doing things is the only one feasible. Things can be done differently, yeah, and well, I don't want to say that this is an easy task. So maybe this is a little bit less problematic, or well, is not of the same order of importance as what I said previously. More or less in every country, regional economic activity is differing from one region to the other. And that is also the case, especially, of course, in South Africa, where place-based economic activity like mining, yeah, is still playing a big role. Yeah. And South Africa is not only sticking out in terms of its high rate of inactivity, but I think it's the only not landlocked country where the economic centers, yeah, of the country are inland, which, of course, in an age of globalization and of trading with distant markets and so on, is not an advantage. Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you have to ship your goods either on lorries or railways to the hundreds of miles to the next harbor, this is, of course, establishing an entry barrier into foreign trade. So that's certainly also something to be kept in mind. And I mean, I think there is no other not landlocked country where the most active region is actually inland, yeah, which in the case of, sorry, here we are with unemployment, so on this slide, yeah. So the Gauteng province is, of course, inland, yeah, having the about 50% higher regional economic activity than sort of the average South African regions, whereas the coastal areas, with the exception of Western Cape, like Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, are among the regions in South Africa with the lowest regional GDP. which is exceptional. Yeah. Now, one South Africa, maybe not the only, but in terms of overall importance, one South African specificity is the still very important role of traditional settlement areas. Yeah. Now, these traditional settlement areas, of course, they are not identical with the apartheid homelands, but there is a big overlap. And what we see in these areas is that there is 1/3 of the Black African population is living in these areas with a very, very low availability of jobs, with a few, let's say, exceptions. When you find an area like the Bafokeng Kingdom, where you have a platinum mine, or I think they also have casinos or things of that sort, then, okay, you have jobs there. But overall, yeah, without these exceptions, these are areas where there is very little economic activity, and it shows also in the household structure. So typically in these areas, the head of household is a woman, which there's nothing wrong about it, but it is because the men have been migrating to other regions where they are hoping to find a job. So that is, of course, I mean, this 1/3 of the Black African population is facing big obstacles, yeah, in finding a role in the economy, and that's contributing to the overall rate of inactivity. Like in many other countries, it's nothing special for South Africa. There is also in some provinces of South Africa, there is a big difference of female and male unemployment. And if we do a scatter plot, yeah, on the right-hand side, then we see that this difference is higher if the overall rate of unemployment, or also call it an indicator of inactivity, is higher. So that is also contributing to overall inactivity. Finally, as I mentioned already, South Africa is having a very low rate of growth, yeah, and this is coinciding with a low or a high rate of inactivity. If we would just carry out the back of the envelope calculation and see what would change in terms of economic growth if South Africa would move its labor participation rate towards Turkey. I mean, Turkey isn't the best student in class in these terms either, but that would lift South African growth rates by 2%. Also, I have to be careful saying that that is not a causality. Yeah, it is a pattern that we observe for other countries. So it's worthwhile to think about how to change the situation in South Africa in terms of labor force participation. And yeah, before that, I should also mention that the high rate of inactivity is also contributing to inequality. So in measured with the Gini coefficient, South Africa has one of, I think, even the highest rate of inequality in the world, or at least among comparable countries. And the contribution of the bottom 20% to overall economic activity is also the lowest. Yeah, I mean, that's not really surprising. So as a conclusion, I would say if South Africa wants to tackle its low rate of economic growth, meaning if it wants to converge to a higher level of economic activity, then it has to tackle its high rate of inactivity. And of course, I wouldn't be from the OECD if I wouldn't have a long list of recommendations here. But maybe this I should keep this actually for the panel, and should end my presentation now. And thank you very much for your attention.
You know, we've been talking a little bit about the purpose of macroeconomic policy, and within that, the kind of choices that are then made about monetary policy, public expenditure, taxation, borrowing, and employment. But if you come from a feminist perspective, your aims for economic policy are very different. We haven't even spoken about the reality of climate change. So the Prof has hinted on the fact that work itself, we need to think differently about work and what we talk about when we talk about informal and formal. We're not even talking about underpaid or unpaid work, which really is the bedrock of any economy, is the work of women and girl children. And, you know, under a feminist lens, we want to think about a green economy, a caring economy. And what does that then look like? What does social infrastructure look like? That then splits us into a conversation about public employment versus private employment. And our research has shown that public employment is under threat in a context where we're talking about high unemployment. Yes, this is the 1/3 that we're talking about, but we're hitting at a point where, you know, we're almost likely to informalize the formal in some respects. So you think about community healthcare workers have been fighting, and this again speaks to the Prof's point about listening and recognizing that they want to be in informal employment as opposed to being part-time, underpaid, undervalued for the work that they do. And these are green jobs as well. There's research being done, some great work that's coming out of the UK on the role of social infrastructure and social employment and investing in the caring economy. So investing in education, investing in health, investing in policing. All of these things make a huge difference in the long run in terms of whether we're talking jobs, livelihoods, or unpaid work. And it has an impact on tax revenues, it lowers social spending, it reduces pressure on public services. This is all out there. These are new ideas. People are doing the research. They're looking at the fiscal multipliers. And yet we are forced, primarily under fiscal consolidation, and this is my second point, into either or thinking. It's either the social relief of distress, or it's jobs, or it's the presidential stimulus program, rather than let's go for all three. Let's have give choices, as the Prof has spoken about, which is important. And then we also, I think it's an important point that you touched on a little bit around the tripartite alliance, which I differ slightly from the Prof, is that if we're talking about how to pay for public investment, how much and who to tax, what and when, and how we should borrow money, then we need to bring the private sector into the conversation. We have to look at who is benefiting from the current spending choices that are being made. And we're seeing that it's forcing more and more, as public services suffer, more and more people are being thrown into precarious situations and dependent on the private sector for services, which are exploitative and can be expensive. So I think, kind of in a little bit of magical thinking, we need to kind of talk about each of these aspects in what we're thinking through around. I do think fiscal policy can make a huge difference. And the purpose of fiscal policy is to complement the choices made around whether we think public services are what we want in society. At the moment, that's not the choice being made. The choice that's being made is to reduce public services with the assumption that the private sector will deliver. But we've seen there's an investment strike. The private sector is not coming to the party, and they're not creating jobs. So something else needs to fit in. And these old ideas, holding on to these old ideas, and even the discussions around growth needs to take into consideration the climate. What are the boundaries? What are the planetary boundaries around which we can exploit resources? And growth is critical for South Africa, but in some countries, a comparative analysis, they're talking about post-growth. They're talking about post-work. And so we need to start thinking a little bit more creatively in our conversations around fiscal policy and macroeconomic policy more broadly. And it came up in the questions as well. I had a look on the questions. And there's very much this sort of, how does this all balance? Inflation, monetary policy, fiscal policy, and these kinds of conversations really enables us to start teasing it out. But I don't want us to lose the perspective that something can be done, because I think something can be done. And those ideas exist. We just need to listen to them, as the Prof was saying.
All right, thank you so much. I think before we take a round of questions, just one more point for me. What are your broader reflections about the notion of the first and the second economy that has always been spoken about over the years? And it seems like, listening to you and Prof now, it seems like that notion has never, I think, worked in the first place, if I'm interpreting you correctly, but you'll correct me if I'm wrong. But you practically see it. Somebody lives in Centurion, but their barber is in Oliven or is in Sunnyside, and they like it like that. Their helper comes from there. So you do have elements of both economies complementing each other. But of course, you're not saying inequality is correct, but the lived realities of South Africans right now, we are faced with those conditions. Then you also have interventions that government does have in the township economic space, for example, that Mthokozisi is going to talk about later, that somewhere, somehow are targeting to better the lives of people. But the far-reaching element for me is the problem, of course. But in reality, do these economies exist, and should they exist?
I mean, I think my first answer is yes, they do exist. I mean, we see them and they're interacting. So if we're using sort of economies in the broad sense. But I think we also need to begin to see what are the vulnerabilities. You're talking about social unrest or flooding or fires. That so-called second economy gets hit. First economy, now I'm getting confused between the two, gets hit. And so we also now need to start thinking about resilience in the way in which economies, or the economy, however we want to talk about it, functions. And I think that's where social policy becomes so important in the context of, one, climate change, two, inequality. And I think the two are interchangeable. And then the Prof online made the point about inactivity means no growth, or growth means no activity. So the two interact with each other. And so how we look at these problems, and as deep and complex as they are, again, I come back to the point that there are creative ideas. The social relief of distress could be seen as a form of income, as opposed to this kind of a drain on the fiscus. It can be something that can stimulate the fiscus by recognizing that people are not going to be easily able to find this golden job that the prof is saying, isn't there, that doesn't exist. Both presentations have spoken about, these jobs are not there, and they're not there now. Maybe, a different kind of structure around, more structural reform, essentially, around how we think about employment and livelihoods.
So how we're going to proceed in this session, we'll ask you, Andreas, to perhaps sum up your presentation in about 10 minutes, focusing mainly, I think, on the key resolutions or recommendations that you're outlining. And I'll also ask, after you are done, Mthokozisi for his, I think, overall remarks as well, throwing on the key themes of this conference and also around the work that he has done on township economies. So I'll also give him about 10 minutes. And then from there on, we'll take 2 questions from the floor and then 2 questions online, and then we basically wrap up. So I'll hand over to you then, Andreas, just for you to sort of sum up your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I will try first to see whether I get again the presentation on screen. Yes, that seems to work now. Just quickly going back to my first slide, South Africa is an outlier in international comparison in terms of the amount of inactivity, meaning people not working, neither in the formal nor in the informal sector. And I have 3 main, let's say, issues or causes in this respect. One is that the transition from school to work is not working properly in South Africa. We see that it takes, let's say, decades longer in South Africa. Yeah, so the maximum employment share is, sorry, maybe if I do that on full screen, then we could, no, I don't see how I can do that here. Anyway, so it takes about 20 years longer, yeah, in South Africa compared to, let's say, Brazil, yeah, to reach the highest employment share. So people are sitting virtually, yeah, and not joining the social activity of working. And I think working is not only an economic activity, but it's also a social activity. I think that is important. The second issue concerning inactivity, I see in the large regional diversity in South Africa, in combination with low labor mobility. Now, of course, we know that mobile labor is moving from one end of the country to the other and settling in townships and informal settlements and things of that kind. But I mean, that's not ideal. Yeah. So transport costs are too high, and social housing is not focusing on establishing new possibilities for South Africans to live where the jobs are. But basically, they are social housing establishments are where land is cheap. Yeah, and so yeah, that's an issue. And so this then naturally, yeah. The one thing that I have not mentioned here is, and you will see that immediately from my recommendations, is South Africa does not have let's say, a public employment agency that is up to the task of, let's say, bringing 1/3 of the population into jobs or into economic activities. Yeah, I mean, this is what I'm thinking about here is something like the Germans have And that would form one of my recommendations. Yeah, establish an effective public employment service to implement active labor market policies. Active labor market policies are supposed to help achieve the matching process between job seekers and companies that are having employees. Yeah, and this is one. I would say this is actually rocket science. I mean, that's not easy. So you cannot just leave the unemployed or the inactives and the companies alone with this issue. So you need strong institutions. I very much like this aspect with this focus on institutions in Professor Friedman's talk. So this is one institution that is missing. Another recommendation I have is concerning the school-to-job transition. Here, the role of employers should be similarly widened as is the case in the apprenticeship systems that are in place in continental European countries like Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and the Netherlands, also some Scandinavian countries. And the focus of these systems is to make sure that the employer, let's say, is taking on a responsibility both for training the participants in these programs and also for providing career opportunities for them. Yeah. So you can say, okay, so why should employers do that? Well, the European employers are doing that because this is allowing them to have a priority access to skilled workers. And whatever the future of the economy is, artificial intelligence or whatever you want, the economy needs skilled workers. And therefore, you need a system that is providing these skills. And no government itself can sort of get this done correctly. You need the active participation of employers to get that done. And finally, I think, programs like the Black Economic Empowerment and all its generations of programs should be more focused on establish economic activity and entrepreneurship in the traditional settlement areas, because these are, in terms of economic activity, white spots on the South African landscape, meaning no jobs and no opportunity for people to participate in economic activity. And 1/3 of the Black Africans, sorry that I use this expression, but I'm not sure what would be a better one. And it's also part of official statistical terminology, is living in such traditional settlement areas. Yeah? And so it's an issue. Okay, that brings me to the end, and again, thanking you for your attention and patience.
Thank you so much, Andreas. We will then now switch to Mthokozisi. I think you've seen the whole range of recommendations and interesting points that have been made by Andreas, and I think they are linked to the earlier discussion we spoke about issues of employment and also productivity or lack thereof in our economy. But you've also done some interesting work, I think, on the township economy. So as part of your remarks, it would be great for you to tell us and everyone who is joining, what are some of the key issues that you have observed, and particularly around maybe how government choices around township economy could better be refined. Over to you, Mthokozisi.
Good afternoon. Thanks for the interesting presentations. that came from Andreas and Steve Friedman. I think in terms of introductory remarks, it's just to make reference to our priority setting mechanism, around budgeting. That within the government, we have got a weak prioritization approach. We don't have appropriate tools that deals with issues of duplication and inefficiencies that exist within a budget in a number of sectors. So just a quick recap is around our structure of the economy. That our economy is mainly driven by the service sector, which requires a skilled labor force, which in a way it poses a challenge to the unskilled labor force that exists, as Andres has mentioned, that since 1994 we have seen the decrease contribution of your manufacturing sector, and in terms of its contribution to GDP and employment. So this poses a challenge in taking into account also that as a country, we are in a low growth trajectory since 2012. So the challenge is, how do we create employment or jobs? How do we respond to issues of youth unemployment? So in terms of some of the proposal that came from the speakers around improving the education outcomes, I'll say perhaps one will need to align your vocational education system to the skills needs and workplace promotion, where would want to deal with issues of skills mismatch that has been highlighted, where you have a mismatch in terms of labor demand and labor supply of unskilled labor force. So you would want also to promote inclusive growth. How could that be achieved? It's how do you revitalize your SMMEs as well as your township economy? The NDP has identified the SMMEs as being the engine in terms of economic growth and employment creation. But as a country, we have not made so much progress in terms of promoting SMMEs. So what is it that is required? It's collaborative approaches that will deal with issues of economic concentration that exist and stimulating competition, ensuring that your SMMEs have access to various value chains that exist. So you have got SMMEs that struggle to access finance, that encounter barriers in terms of entry into a number of markets. So these are some of the issues that one would need to promote. Then there was the issue where I think Friedman mentioned around, I think it was around relationships. I think it's the issue, if one were to expand on this, is the issue of trust deficit that exists between government, private sector, and labor, which at times it brings a challenge in terms of responding to some of the triple challenges that we have as a country. So there is need for more social compacting to enable the country to respond to some of these challenges. So around the issue of the informal economy, which it provides livelihood for a number of people, I think there is need for government to relook into that model. It's not for government to provide a strategy that in the main it looks at graduating some of the informal entrepreneurs to the formal sector, because that strategy it is discriminatory in its nature, because what it does, it picks up the winners and leaves the majority. So these are some of the issues that perhaps they need to be tackled. And Andres talked about the issue of labor market institution being rigid. I think it's something that the government has to look at. government has tried to intervene in terms of promoting employment creation. We have seen the presidential economic stimulus or the presidential youth employment schemes and your employment youth incentives that have been rolled out, but they have not made a dent in terms of responding to some of the unemployment challenges that we're facing as a country. So what is it as a country that we need to do so that we are able to reap what they call it? It's a youth dividend. How do we invest in our youth so that there are gains that are achieved into that? So it's some of the questions that remain unanswered. So it's something that we need to look at the quality of the jobs that are being created as well. To say, because work, we know that work is important as in terms of alleviating poverty, but that does not mean that if a household head has got a job, that translates to lower vulnerability to poverty. So we need to look at the types of jobs that are being created. Also, there are issues of as a country, we have got what we call it a low intergenerational mobility, which at times it makes it difficult for the country to respond to issues of inequality and poverty. So which means if one were to compare the outcomes of the current generation vis-a-vis the outcomes of the previous generation, so how do we respond to some of those challenges? It's something that as a country we need to relook. And we find ourselves in a situation whereby we are in a slump, and we want to embark on fiscal consolidation. The question is where will growth come from? Because what we have seen in some countries is that they've utilized fiscal policy to prop up or to promote economic growth, but we are in a situation whereby we have got a contractional monetary policy and a contractional fiscal policy, which is likely in the long run to impact negatively on economic growth. In the short run, we can be able to stabilize what you call the government expenditure, but in the long run, these are some of the challenges that we are likely to face. Thank you.
So what are some of, I think, the key emerging findings from the case studies and also your observations in the work that you do on township economies? I hope you got that.
It is something that is doable, but the key thing as a country that we're still battling with is responding to infrastructure challenges, like your energy sector, ensuring that there is reliable electricity, because SMMEs will struggle to embark on alternative or to utilize alternative energy sources when there are these outages. So in a way, without responding to issues of infrastructure challenges, it becomes a problem. But you want to ensure that regulation within the space is reduced. You would want to ensure that we have got supply chain development, that enables your SMMEs in the township space to be able to access the value chains, the various value chains in the economy. Because a number of these SMMEs, they struggle, especially in townships. You will have them producing goods, but they struggle to sell those goods. So it's something that government has to look at that. And also, how do they access finance? Is it loans? Is it what you call what kind of a financing model that could be utilized that is not similar to what is offered by the commercial banks? It's something that we need to look. And how do we stimulate competition? Because there is so much concentration in a number of sectors, like where small firms, they struggle, you know. You have got these large firms that dominate the entire value chain, you know. So how do we ensure that there's competition? It's one of those issues. So if those issues are addressed, you have a situation whereby your SMMEs can be able to flourish.
Thank you so much, Mthokozisi. I think, Vusi, then let's open up the floor for a round of questions, and also not forgetting those online. I think before we took the break, there was a question around the contribution of the retail sector into the main stream economy. So we'll take that into account when our panelists respond. So maybe let's take 2 questions or so, and then also take those that are online.
I would really like to know what could be the alternatives that we can actually do. Because, for instance, this is a huge compromise, or this is a huge pressure, or which is from the previous session when we talked about the financing part. But now it comes at the crisis that we have, which is unemployment and inequality, which is very critical, as Andreas stated there, that in the case of South Africa, we are an outlier when we are being compared to other countries in terms of inequality and unemployment. Now, Thoko mentioned that private sector is not hiring. Government just froze the posts. Then we have this crisis in hand. What is the alternative that we have? Because I have a belief of saying that this debt financing is not sustainable, that we are actually continuing to incur. And also that could be the time-ticking bomb in our hands, that part. And also, so that we don't find ourselves in the same position now discussing the debt financing that has escalated, and then that came in the compromise of unemployment and inequality that might be exacerbated in the future. So that we don't see ourselves in this kind of situation, what is it that needs to be done so that I do believe that we would need to save the part of inequality and unemployment. Thank you.
Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, and thank you to our panel for the presentations. I think I want to comment on what Mthokozisi was saying, which it's actually linked to the previous presentation. The issue of weak participation or prioritization by our government in terms of informing the allocations. I just want to know, what is it that we can do to actually try to assist, taking into consideration that government alone cannot actually build this economy. We need the private sector. But how do we converge in a situation where we are able to know what can we prioritize, where we can have multiplier effects that can actually boost the economy? I'm linking this also to the fact of the issue of infrastructure. We all know that infrastructure is an enabler that is actually important in terms of actually building the economy. But given the status that we are at now, how do you know which infrastructure we must actually prioritize? And as government and also private sector, we all rally behind that so that we can see the benefits, that we can actually create the jobs that we would like to create. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe let's take 2 online and then allow Prof. Andreas, Thoko, and Mthokozisi to respond.
All right, certainly. Online, we have more comments, I think, more than we do have questions. So I'll quickly try to get through them. The first one came from, I remember, from Anthony Hazel, who is the special advisor in the office of the executive mayor of the city of Cape Town. And he says the success of public employment programs should be measured in terms of extent to which participants graduate into other forms of employment and or further development, and not only in terms of immediate poverty alleviations. He received 3 loves and 1 like. There we do have Makutu and Zianewi. I think he's a Deputy Director for Environmental and Cultural Sector, EPWP. He says he fully agrees with Prof. and Andrea as perspective. However, he notes it must be noted that we need curriculum reforms in South Africa to address technical skills required by the economy. our current curriculum is not aligned to the skills required by the economy. That is Makutu. And Petelo Pasha, who's streaming live from Centurion, and he's a project manager for the South African Medical Research Council, says, I'm of the opinion that our government must work on programs for students to go around the world to be trained in countries with which possesses the extent expertise that we need in our mining, IT, engineering, town planning, so that we can have this response. And maybe Tsimakutu coming again there. So let me end with the last one there by Najaha, I think Alice Andres, who's a Deputy Director, General Employment Facilitation, Head of Jobs Fund at the National Treasury. That says the quality and impact of jobs that are created and enjoy beyond a short-term stimulus is different to short-term opportunities. So definitely is all more comments than questions there, Vili.
Okay, all right, thank you so much. So this is what I would propose, Prof. Maybe we get your overall responses and remarks, and then we move to Andreas, and then Thoko, and then Mthokozisi. Thank you.
Given that, I think I've got 3 online questions here. Should I respond to them now?
Yeah.
Okay. Look, I've got the online questions here, which I managed to access. But before I do that, just from the issues that have been raised at the moment, there are just 2 I wanted to respond to. The first one was the one about curriculum reform, which I think is entirely right. But I wonder if we don't need to rethink that as well, because a very common refrain in this country, which most of us have been hearing for years, is that the schools don't produce people for the job market. And there are 2 problems with that. The first problem is that there's not much point in producing people from the job market if there's no job market for them, if they're not going to find jobs. And we do have a problem now. At one stage, our problem was that you needed once you had a certain qualification, you got a job. But if you didn't have that qualification, you got left by the wayside. And now quite a lot of people who have those qualifications are being left by the wayside. So, this idea that there's it goes back to the points I was making this morning. Part of the thinking in the jobs debate is somehow there are a whole lot of jobs out there, and as long as we train people correctly, then they will be able to fill those jobs. There's a problem about that. There's also a problem, incidentally, about the very narrow view you hear very often about, why on earth do people get educated in the humanities and, all this nonsense with history and social. Well, if you look at about any society I can think of, you can't actually have economic success unless there's a certain amount of people who trained in those particular skills, etc., because they contribute immensely to economic skills. But the point is surely that we need to start thinking about how our education system can equip people for the realities I was describing this morning. And it's precisely in that context that I think you need less of this narrow vocational focus, which I've criticized for the reasons I've already given, and far more on, let's call them economic coping skills. In other words, the set of skills people need to operate in a world in which they won't get that automatic job in a factory, a shop, or an office, no matter what their qualifications are. I think there's a lot that the education system can do on that front. The other one was the point here, well, how do we balance the priorities of the private sector with the demands of job creation and growth? And I wouldn't say job creation, of course, I'd say creation and expansion of livelihoods. Just a general point. I've been arguing for a long time, and I continue to argue, that we're not going to get out of the kind of economic cul-de-sac that we're in. In other words, we are not going to get out of a low growth or no growth economy until we have a very serious negotiation stretching over a few years between the major economic actors in this country. Because part of the problem that I was describing this morning when I talked about, well, you only change your political system, is that in 1994 we negotiated a new political system, but we didn't negotiate a new economy, and we didn't negotiate new professions, and we didn't negotiate a new society. And therefore you have this problem that I mentioned earlier. You still have 20 companies controlling 80% of the equity on the JSE. So what we need is a negotiation about how we include the 2/3 who are currently excluded. And I just want to stress one point, which, if we're getting down to practicalities here, is when one talks about negotiation, South Africans always get the impression that you're talking about a three-day event at a resort hotel, which is the way we tend to approach these things. 3-day events at resorts hotels lead at the end to people signing declarations they have absolutely no intention of ever honouring, and then they go home. If you consider that there are some very deep divisions here, there's some very deep changes that have to be made, you can't do that over 3 days in one venue. You have to do that over a period of years. And I'm far more interested, when I talk about negotiation, I'm far more interested in engagement between the various actors over what they can agree on at any particular time, and then moving on to hopefully more bigger issues later on. So those are my responses to those. So then I've got these 3 questions here. The first one was, how does the analysis I give this morning relate to the current ownership structure of the Reserve Bank? And I can see where the question's coming from, because the Reserve Bank ownership at the moment is a fairly good, it is an outlier, and it is a fairly good example of path dependence, in the sense that I think the most coherent argument you get for why it continues is, well, it's been there for a long time, and it would be messy to actually get rid of it. So I can understand where it's coming from, but I do want to stress that I really don't think it matters terribly much. I mean, the reality is that monetary policy is not set by the people who have private entities who have shares in the Reserve Bank. I think the question of the bank's mandate, and listening to the responses here this morning and this afternoon, I mean, there clearly is a feeling that we need to look at monetary policy again. And that is an alive issue. That is an issue on which a lot of debate is needed, but I don't think the ownership structure matters very much. The second question, of course, was, what are the constraints to growth? How do we get on a different growth path? And I think I've answered that already. I think that we need this negotiation, but in a sense, before we get to that, we need to get to that negotiation. Before we get to that negotiation, I think there's a lot of work to be done in making the case that we need the negotiation. And the kind of ideas I was suggesting this morning are really designed to get us thinking in different ways, so that we can hopefully start shifting the policy agenda, because it's only once you shift the policy agenda that the major actors start saying, well, actually, we have a way of dealing with this which we need to look at seriously. So I think that there's a big task at the moment in creating the climate of opinion which would make that sort of negotiation possible. And the third question is the question of poverty and unemployment, which we've been dealing at, and how do we describe, how do we understand this country's poor performance on both? And of course, Andreas was calling us an outlier quite appropriately, because we are an outlier in all sorts of ways. Well, I think I've kind of answered that. I mean, I think that the way in which we think about these problems creates a situation in which the same obstacles which existed before 1994 simply carry on after 1994 in a new guise. I mean, the bottom line in very unacademic language is that this is a very difficult economy to get into. A colleague of mine who runs a center on competition at UJ gave his inaugural lecture in which he invents this young man in a township who invents a soft drink. And all his friends love the soft drink, and they say it tastes great. And the rest of the lecture is his attempt to actually get his soft drink onto the market. And he's basically beaten by the power of the large manufacturers, by the power of the retailer, etc. And he has to give up, and he never actually markets his soft drink. I think those kind of obstacles are still there, and we need a very serious negotiation about how we remove those obstacles. Because at the moment, and I will leave with that thought, one of the implications of what I'm saying, and it relates to your question about poverty and unemployment, is that at the moment this economy runs on the skills and energies of 1/3 of the population. And it's not rocket science to say that we need an economy which operates on everybody's energies and enthusiasms and ideas. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Prof. We're actually over time, so I'll just quickly ask Andreas, Thoko, Mthokozisi, just in a minute to sum up, and then we close as Vusi comes back on stage as well.
Okay, I think the Prof has summed it up beautifully. I think just in closing, what I would encourage us to think about, just to link the spending choices discussion earlier this morning, is really what kind of a state do we want to invest in, especially if we're seeing this contradiction between budget and policy when it comes to employment within the public sector. And that I'd even go further to say, if we're wanting to address climate change and inequality and deal with gender equity, then we should be looking at social infrastructure and the jobs that go into the caring economy. And that we need to have a conversation about investing in those kinds of public jobs that are green and also care for communities and are absolutely critical. So I think that's just where I would like to leave off.
Thank you so much. Andreas, and then Mthokozisi.
I'm trying to be comprehensive, yeah, but at the same time short. So let me just first clarify. When I was speaking about the Public Employment Service, I'm not talking about an institution that is creating public sector jobs. That's not what I'm thinking about here. But this is an institution that facilitates the match between a job seeker and a vacancy in the non-governmental sector. Yeah, because the government has its own recruitment channels, so that it doesn't need such an institution. But just a huge amount of inactives in the South African population, in my way, makes it hard to understand why such an institution does not exist. For instance, like in Germany, where there is a countrywide institution that assesses the qualifications of the job seeker, checks what kind of additional skills that person might need, finds the right training facilities for them, and in all these stages connects with employers that are looking for that type of job. And I think it, sorry, Professor Friedman, but it's, why should there be no jobs exactly in South Africa? I mean, this is such a wonderful country. The whole world would like to come here if it would find the environment where normal economic activity can be carried out. For instance, without power cuts and things of that sort. So, I mean, the issue about jobs availability is an issue about solving the framework distortions and finding a way how able entrepreneurs that have ideas like the one with the soft cream can actually establish their businesses and create a successful and profitable company. So now, doing so, of course, one has to acknowledge this is about, let's say, setting up institutions or reforming institutions like the school to job transition. And here, maybe overall, I would say, okay, I mean, does South Africa need a radically new way of doing things in terms of economic activity? maybe, I would not rule that out, but why not keep that on an experimental level? And at the same time, just look at what other countries, comparable countries, are getting right and how they are providing the opportunities so that the entrepreneurs can create jobs and the job seekers can find high quality opportunities for their human capital.
Maybe Mthokozisi can come in literally 30 seconds just for you to say goodbye.
Okay, thanks. I'll say there is need for trade-offs that have to be made within government, because everything can't be a priority. So that the limited resources that are there could be put into greater use, and also to improve state capacity in terms of procurement and oversight of a number of built environment infrastructure. We have seen cost overruns in a number of infrastructure projects, Kusile, Medupi, that have not enabled the country to be able to generate sufficient electricity or energy. So I think we need to deal with the quality of services that are being procured, cost overruns. So those are some of the issues that needs to be addressed by our economy. Thank you.
So let me take this time and extend a warm word of appreciation to all our panel members. I think we had an extensive and a bit longer discussion, and apologies again once more. We'll just ask that as we wrap up, we'll have our next session on the just energy transition, and Vusi is going to do the introductions. So with those words, thank you so much. And I also want to say that to all the participants, for those questions that have not been responded to, we will take them down and also email them. So for Prof, we may send you further emails with some questions and then respond to everyone else. Thank you so much, everyone. Let's give a warm round of applause as we stand up to thank all the members of our panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veli, and all the guests. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prof.
Okay.
Thank you.